They never warn you, when you are born a daughter in a house already drowning, that one day your father will sell your future to save his own name, and smile while he does it. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you are exactly where you need to be. Before we go any further into Alara's world, before the cold castle, the silent duke, and the secret that will change everything, take a moment and subscribe to this channel. Hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one. Because what happens next is the kind of tale you will want to tell someone else before it is finished. Now, let's go back to the morning it all began. Alara Voss woke on the day of her 18th birthday to the sound of her mother moving through her small bedroom with the brisk, purposeful energy of a woman performing a task she did not wish to examine too closely. The curtains were drawn back. The gray morning light of early autumn spilled across the floor like something spilled and not cleaned up. On the chair beside the writing desk sat a dress Alara had never seen before, ivory silk, high-collared, trimmed with seed pearls that caught the pale light and threw it back in small, cold sparks. It was a wedding dress. Alara sat up slowly. She had known, in the distant, muffled way one knows things one cannot yet afford to feel, that this day was coming. She had heard the conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. She had seen her father's correspondence sealed with wax and carried out by riders who would not say where they were headed. She had been 17 when the whispers started, and she had spent the months since then building, quietly and methodically, a wall around the softest parts of herself. Now she looked at the dress, and she looked at her mother, and she said nothing at all. "It fits," her mother said, as though the dress were already on her body and the matter were already settled. "I had it made from your measurements last month. I didn't tell you because," she paused. The pause lasted too long, because there was nothing to be decided. Alara rose from the bed. She was not a remarkable-looking girl, or so she had always been told. Her elder sisters claimed the beauty in the family, the soft gold hair and the easy smiles that gathered attention the way honey gathered flies. Alara was darker in coloring, quieter in bearing, with the kind of face that people forgot in company and then found themselves remembering, strangely, later in stillness. Her eyes were a deep, serious brown, and they had a way of seeing things that made people who were hiding something feel unaccountably seen. She crossed to the window. Below, the grounds of her father's estate stretched out toward the road, modest grounds, somewhat overgrown, the garden long since surrendered to the practical over the beautiful. She could see the stables, where only 2 horses remained. She could see the east wall, where the stonework had been crumbling for 2 years now, and no mason had been called. "Who is he?" she asked. Her voice was calm. She had worked very hard to make it calm. Her mother began pinning flowers into a length of ribbon. Small white flowers, slightly bruised at the edges. "The Duke of Ashimore," she said. "Aldrich. The name landed in the quiet room like a stone dropped into still water. Alara turned from the window. "They call him mad," she said. Not an accusation. A statement of a fact she required her mother to address. "People call many things many names," her mother replied, which was not an answer, and they both knew it. She crossed to where Alara stood and began working the ribbon into her daughter's dark hair with the practiced, mechanical movements of a woman who had long since learned to keep her hands busy when her heart was compromised. Her fingers were cold. They had always been cold, Alara remembered. Even in summer, even when she was small and reached for them in the night. "They say he is violent," Alara said. "They say he drove his first betrothed to flee the country. They say the servants at Ashimore are kept by contract and by fear." She paused. "They say he has spells, episodes, in which he does not know himself. They say a great many things." Her mother's hands still briefly against her hair. "Just briefly. Your father has spoken at length with the Duke's man of affairs. The arrangement has been reviewed. It is," another pause. The word she chose next arrived carefully, like a foot testing ice. "Acceptable. Acceptable." Alara turned the word over in her mind. Not safe. Not good. Not he will be kind to you, I promise. Acceptable. She did not weep. She had wept, once, when she was 14, and her father had sold the bay mare she had trained herself, the one that came when she whistled, the one that had been hers in the only way that mattered. She had wept then, and her father had told her not to be theatrical, and the mayor had been led away, and nothing about it had changed. She had not wept over anything since. She had decided, in the practical, unflinching way of a girl who reads more than she is supposed to and understands more than she is given credit for, that tears were a currency she could not afford to waste on outcomes she could not alter. She let her mother finish with the ribbon. She let the dress be settled over her shoulders, the cold silk whispering against her skin. She allowed her hands to be inspected and her hair to be deemed sufficient. She stood straight while her younger sister, Mira, 14, wide-eyed and horrified in the honest, uncomplicated way of children who do not yet know to hide their horror, stood in the doorway and watched with her bottom lip caught between her teeth. "Will you write to me?" Mira asked very quietly when their mother stepped out. "Every week," Elara said. "What if he?" Mira stopped. Then, with great effort, with the visible courage of someone forcing themselves to say the unsayable, "What if he is what they say?" Elara looked at her sister, 14 years old and already learning the shape of the world. Already learning that the people who were supposed to protect you sometimes handed you, instead, to the thing you feared and called a duty. She crossed the room and pressed a kiss to Myra's forehead, the way she had done since Mira was an infant and she had been 4 years old, and decided, with the absolute authority of a child, that this small creature was hers to look after. "Then I will manage," she said. "I have always managed." The carriage came at 9:30. Her father stood in the entrance hall to see her off, a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the ruined handsomeness of someone who had once been impressive and had spent it carelessly. He had not looked her directly in the eye since the previous evening. He looked at her now and seemed, for a moment, to be standing on the edge of something, a word, a gesture, some acknowledgement of what he was doing and to whom. Elara waited. She would have accepted it, whatever it was. Even something small, even just her name, spoken as though it mattered. He cleared his throat. He straightened the cuff of his coat. "Be gracious," he said, "and do not cause trouble." Elara looked at him for one long moment. Then she picked up her traveling case and walked through the door. The road to Ashenmoor stretched north through the thinning autumn landscape, the trees bleeding amber and rust along the roadside, the sky pressing low and pewter gray as though it too were in mourning. Elara sat with her spine perfectly straight against the carriage seat, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed into an expression of complete and deliberate neutrality. The wheels rolled on. The estate disappeared behind her. She was 18 years old. She was being delivered, like a letter sealed by someone else's hand, to a man the world called dangerous, and the world called broken, and the world called mad. And not one person who had signed her name to this arrangement had seen fit to ask her what she thought or felt or feared. She pressed her shoulder blades against the seat back and lifted her chin and watched the countryside pass. If they expected her to arrive at Ashenmoor Castle undone, frightened and weeping and easy to manage, then they had spent 18 years failing to pay attention. She would not give any of them the satisfaction. The first thing Elara noticed about Ashenmoor Castle was that it did not look like madness. It looked like grief. There was a difference, she had come to believe, between a place that had been broken by chaos and a place that had been abandoned by joy. Chaos left marks. Things overturned, things neglected, the visible residue of a mind that could no longer hold its own edges. But grief was different. Grief was orderly. Grief maintained. Grief kept the stonework repaired and the iron gates oiled and the gravel drive raked into clean, precise lines. And yet somehow, despite all of that maintenance, despite every surface being exactly as it should be, the whole of it felt like something holding its breath. Ashenmoor was holding its breath. The carriage passed through the outer gates as the afternoon light failed. The sky above the towers, having deepened from pewter to the dark, bruised purple of an old wound. Elara looked up at the castle as it came into full view. For towers, a great central hall, walls of dark stone that had absorbed centuries of rain and cold until they had taken on the color of deep water. It was not ugly. That surprised her. She had constructed, over the weeks of her anticipation, a building that matched the reputation of its master. something grim and decayed and threatening. Instead, Ashmore was severe, yes, and unwelcoming in the way of things that have never needed to welcome anyone, but there was a grandeur to it that caught in the chest, as though beauty had been present here once, and had not entirely departed, but had simply retreated inward, to somewhere less exposed. The carriage stopped before the main entrance. A footman materialized to open the door, young, fair-haired, with a carefully neutral expression of someone who had been trained to reveal nothing. He helped her down without speaking. The gravel crunched beneath her traveling boots. The air was sharper here than it had been on the road, carrying the smell of wood smoke and cold stone, and faintly something green, a garden somewhere, still clinging to its last autumn growth. The housekeeper met her at the door. She was a woman of perhaps 60, compact and straight-backed, with silver hair drawn into a severe knot and eyes that were unexpectedly kind, the careful, considered kindness of a person who does not distribute it carelessly. She introduced herself as Mrs. Aldrin, head of household, and she looked at Alara with an expression that was not pity, precisely, but something in the neighborhood of it. The look of a woman who understood exactly what it was to arrive somewhere you had not chosen, and who had decided some time ago to be useful rather than sympathetic. "You'll want to refresh yourself before you're received," Mrs. Aldrin said. Not a question. She led Alara through an entrance hall paneled in dark wood and hung with portraits, whose subjects all seemed to share the same storm-gray eyes and the same expression of having made peace with something difficult. Up a wide staircase, along a corridor where tall windows looked out over the rear grounds, and there was the garden she had smelled, larger than she had imagined. Walled in old stone, currently a study in the amber and bronze of late autumn. A man was walking in it, alone. He moved with the slow, deliberate pacing of someone working through a problem in his mind, hands clasped behind his back, head slightly bowed. Alara stopped walking. "The Duke," Mrs. Aldrin said simply, from just ahead, and did not slow her pace. Alara walked on, but she held the image. She was given a room that occupied the entire south corner of the east wing, large, well-appointed, with a fire already laid and burning warmly and fresh flowers on the writing desk that must have been ordered in from a glasshouse, because nothing was blooming outside in this weather. She noticed that someone had arranged for fresh flowers. She filed it away beside the trembling hand she had not yet been able to explain. She washed. She changed from her traveling clothes into the dress that had been laid out, one from her own cases, a deep green wool that had been her mother's once and remade for her, the best thing she owned that was not the wedding silk. She sat before the mirror long enough to tidy her hair. She did not look at herself for longer than was useful. She had never found the habit productive. The knock at her door came exactly when Mrs. Aldrin had said it would. She was escorted down to a receiving room off the main hall, smaller than she had expected, with 2 chairs positioned before a fire that was doing serious work against the evening chill, and books on every available surface, and a desk in the far corner so buried in papers and correspondence that it had the look of a thing under siege. The Duke of Ashmore was standing when she entered. He did not turn immediately. He was looking at something on the desk, and he finished reading it, or at least he gave that impression, before he turned to face her. He was not what she had built in her imagination. She had expected something obvious. A wildness in the eye, perhaps, or the restless, uncontained energy she associated with the word mad, something that would announce itself immediately so she could take her measure of it and decide how to stand. She had prepared herself for the obvious thing. Aldrich Kane was not the obvious thing. He was tall, considerably taller than she had anticipated, with the lean, angular build of a man who moved a great deal and ate when he remembered to. His face was fine-boned and sharply structured, framed by dark hair that had grown slightly past the point of fashionability, as though someone had meant to see to it and the appointment had been postponed too many times. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years beyond it. It was difficult to say, because there was something about him that seemed both younger and older than any specific age, as though time had treated him unevenly. His eyes were exactly as the portrait in the hall had suggested. Storm gray. Still. He looked at her with those eyes, and she understood immediately. in the instinctive way of someone accustomed to reading rooms, that he was not seeing through her or past her the way men of his rank generally looked at women of hers. He was seeing her with an attention that was complete and somewhat startling, as though she were the only thing in the room worth the effort, and the effort was considerable. He said, "Miss Voss." Not my lady. Not the formal address she had prepared for. Miss Voss, the name she was still in possession of, for a few hours longer. "Your Grace," she replied. A pause. Not an uncomfortable one, precisely, but waited, the pause of two people each waiting to learn what the other would do next. Then he gestured, briefly, toward the chairs. She sat. He sat. A footman appeared with tea, and then, reading something in the air of the room, promptly vanished again. Alara poured. She did not ask if he took sugar, because something told her, correctly, that he drank it plain. She set his cup near his hand, and he looked at it, and then at her, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Surprise, she thought. Very small. Very quickly contained. "You're not frightened," he said. It was not a question. It was the observation of someone who had expected something else and was recalibrating. "I have not decided yet," she said honestly. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The structural suggestion of one, as though the muscles required had not been called upon in some time and needed a moment to recall their purpose. "That," he said quietly, "is a more intelligent answer than I expected." She looked at him steadily. "What answer did you expect?" He picked up his tea. He looked into it rather than at her. "Pairs," he said. "Or performance. Most people, when they arrive here, choose one or the other." "I find neither particularly useful," Alara said. This time the silence that followed was different from the first one. It had less wariness in it, and something else she couldn't yet name, something that felt, tentatively and improbably, like the very early stages of mutual recognition. Outside, the wind moved through the castle grounds. The fire shifted and settled. The evening pressed in against the windows. She was married to this man in the morning. She did not know him. She did not know this place. She did not know what her life was about to become, or whether it held anything worth the holding. But he had not been what she expected. And in the narrow, careful accounting of a girl who had learned to measure her hope in very small units, that was not nothing. That was, in fact, the first thing. The morning of the wedding arrived the way all inevitable things arrived, not with drama, but with the quiet, implacable momentum of a tide that had been building long before anyone thought to look at the water. Alara was awake before the light. She had slept in a large, well-appointed room with its fire burnt down to embers, and its fresh flowers slowly releasing their fragrance into the dark, and she had slept better than she had any right to, not peacefully, precisely, but deeply, the way a body sleeps when it has been running on vigilance for so long that exhaustion finally overrides even anxiety. She lay still for several minutes after waking, looking up at the unfamiliar ceiling, listening to Ashenmoor breathe around her. The castle had sounds she was still learning. Settle and shift. Wind finding the edges of old windows. The distant, muffled industry of a kitchen already at work somewhere far below. She rose. She washed in the cold water from the basin. She did not ring for hot, not wanting the fuss of it, not wanting the attendance and the performance of preparation that would come with them. She stood at the window in her nightgown and looked out over the gray morning grounds, the garden walls, the sky above the east tower, just beginning to lighten toward a pale and watery dawn. She allowed herself 5 minutes to feel everything she was not going to show anyone. She was afraid. She was lonely with a loneliness so fundamental it had become structural, the way damp becomes structural in old houses, present in the walls, in the foundations, something you stop noticing because it had always been there. She was 18 years old and she was standing in a stranger's castle preparing to marry a man she had spoken 40 sentences to, and the life she had imagined for herself, quiet, modest, but her own, had been folded up and put away somewhere she could not reach it. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window. Then she took her hand back. She turned away from the glass. She rang for the attendants. The ceremony was held in the castle's private chapel, a narrow stone room with tall, thin windows through which the weak autumn light entered apologetically, as though uncertain of its welcome. The altar cloth was dark blue velvet, slightly faded at the edges in the way of things that had been fine once, and were not replaced because their quality was still technically sufficient. Candles burned in iron holders. The air smelled of cold stone and beeswax and old wood, and underneath it all, faint as a memory, incense from services long past. There were perhaps 30 people present. Alara recognized none of them. Several were what she took to be the senior members of the castle household. Mrs. Aldrin, standing straight as a sentinel near the left wall, and the steward, a lean, watchful man named Harwick, whom she had been briefly introduced to the previous afternoon. The remaining guests were local, county families, she supposed, summoned by obligation rather than warmth, here to witness and to note, and then to take the information home and add it to the existing architecture of rumor surrounding the Duke of Ashmore and his peculiar arrangements. She felt their attention as she walked the length of the chapel. Not hostile, exactly, more the careful, collective regard of people watching for something they had been told to expect, scanning her for evidence of whatever narrative they had already decided on. The Mad Duke's newest acquisition. The Baron's dispensable daughter. She kept her eyes forward and her pace even, and she let them look because she could not stop them. But she did not perform distress for their benefit. Aldrich was waiting at the altar. He was dressed formally, a coat of deep charcoal gray that fit him with the precision of something made rather than purchased, white linen, dark gloves that he removed and held in one hand as she approached. He had shaved. His hair had been brought to a slightly better approximation of order. He looked, she thought, like a man who had made a private decision about something and had arrived at it in peace, though the path had cost him. He watched her come toward him down the length of the chapel with those still, gray eyes, and he did not look away, not once, and there was something in that steadiness, in the fact that he did not glance at the watching faces, did not perform relief or satisfaction for their benefit, simply looked at her, and only her, that settled something small and tightly wound in her chest. She took her place beside him. He was close enough that she could have counted the precise number of silver threads in the gray of his coat. Close enough that she was aware, with an acuity she found annoying, of the warmth that came off him, at odds with every cold thing about this morning. The clergyman began. Alara had expected to feel the words as a kind of closing, a door being shut, a key being turned. She stood through the liturgy and listened, and said what she was required to say in the steady, clear voice she had trained herself to produce in place of the voice that shook, and she did feel the weight of it, the gravity of standing in a chapel in a dress she had not chosen, speaking vows she had not written. But the feeling was more complex than simple loss. There was something else threaded through it, something almost like defiance. She had been handed to this moment without her consent, yes. But she was standing in it on her own terms, with her spine straight and her eyes clear. And whatever came next would have to reckon with the fact that she was not a passive participant in her own life. She had simply, temporarily, she told herself, run out of alternatives. When the moment came for the ring, Aldrich turned to face her fully. He took her left hand in both of his, a gesture that was not in the formal order of the service, not required, simply done. And she felt the warmth of his hands, bare now without the gloves, the slight roughness of them, the careful way he held hers, as though conscious of his own strength relative to her smaller bones. He slid the ring onto her finger, and his hands trembled. Not violently, not visibly, perhaps, to anyone standing more than a few feet away. But she was standing right beside him with her hand in his, and she felt it, one single involuntary tremor that moved through both his hands at once, like a vibration through a bowstring after the arrow has been released. It lasted perhaps a second. Then it was gone, and his hands were steady again, and he was looking at the ring on her finger with an expression she could not fully read. Not regret, not triumph. Something quieter than either. She looked up at his face and found, unexpectedly, that he was already looking at hers. They regarded each other for a moment that stretched slightly beyond what the ceremony required, while the clergyman intoned the concluding words and the candles burned and the watching faces watched. Then it was done. She was the Duchess of Ashmore. The guests observed the formalities with the stiff cordiality of people fulfilling an obligation. A small wedding breakfast was consumed with careful, correct conversation, and the whole business concluded before midday with the county families departing in their carriages and the castle settling back into itself like a creature resuming its natural shape after having been required briefly to perform a different one. Alara sat alone in the receiving room afterward, still in the wedding dress, the ring new and strange on her finger, the flowers on the desk 2 days older now and beginning to turn at the edges. She thought about the trembling hands. She thought about the look he had given her over the ring. She thought about the shape of a man who was supposed to be mad and violent and dangerous, who had instead poured tea and asked careful questions and stood beside her at an altar with shaking hands and the expression of someone attempting, very privately, to be equal to something that mattered. She turned the ring in a slow circle around her finger. Outside, a rook called once from the battlements, and then the grounds fell silent. The candles had been lit by the time Alara was brought to the ducal chambers, all of them, every holder on every surface, so that the room burned with a warmth that was almost aggressive, as though someone had anticipated cold of a different kind and had tried to compensate in the only way available to them. She had expected many things. She had spent the hours between the wedding breakfast and the evening constructing a quiet, private architecture of expectation. Not hope. She was too careful for hope, but the kind of strategic anticipation that allowed her to prepare a response to whatever came next. She had expected awkwardness, perhaps. Obligation performed with varying degrees of consideration. She had expected, at best, a civil distance, two people agreeing, without saying so, to be strangers in proximity. She had not expected to find the Duke of Ashmore sitting in the chair by the window in his shirt sleeves, a document spread across his knees, looking up at her entrance with the expression of a man who had also been waiting, but for something other than what the occasion conventionally suggested. The maid who had accompanied Alara withdrew immediately. The door closed. Aldrich set the document aside. He did not rise, not out of discourtesy she sensed, but because standing would have made the room into something more formal than he intended it to be. He gestured to the chair across from him, the one angled toward the fire, the one that had been placed, she noticed this, with its back to the wall, giving whoever sat in it a clear view of the room. A small thing. A thoughtful thing. She sat. He looked at her for a long moment in the candlelight. Then he said, "I owe you the truth." Alara clasped her hands in her lap. "I would say so, yes," she said. Something moved through his expression, not quite amusement, but an acknowledgement of it. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and looked into the fire rather than at her. And when he began to speak, his voice had the particular quality of a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has made a deliberate and somewhat exhausting decision to put it down. "My name has been systematically destroyed," he said, "for 7 years. Not by accident. Not by the natural accumulation of misunderstanding or idle gossip. By design and by specific people, for a specific purpose." Alara said nothing. She watched him. There is a faction at court, 3 men at the center of it, with satellites I am still identifying, whose financial interests depend upon Ashmore being absorbed into the Crown's holdings. Not sold. Absorbed. Which requires only one thing. He paused. That I be declared legally incompetent. That a court of sufficiency rule that I am unfit to manage my own title, my own estate, my own affairs. At which point guardianship passes to the Crown. The land is parceled, the holdings are liquidated. And the men who have spent 7 years building the case that I am mad. He said the word with the flat, precise contempt of someone who has been called a thing so many times they have burned out the capacity for it to wound. Collect what they have been waiting for. The fire shifted. A log settled. The candlelight moved across the angles of his face. "The episodes they describe," he continued. "The violence. The erratic behavior. The betrothed who fled the country. A pause that had something almost wry in it, dark and very dry. Lady Cecilia did not flee the country because she was afraid of me. She fled because she was part of it. Her role was to provide testimony regarding my instability. When I discovered the arrangement and confronted her father, the story became that I had done so in a rage. that I had threatened them, that I was precisely what they had been saying I was. His jaw tightened. She is currently living very comfortably in a house in the south of France that was purchased with money I cannot yet prove came from the men I am describing. But I will. Ilara sat with this. She sat with it carefully. The way you sit with a structure you are not sure yet will bear weight, testing each beam before you trust the next. Why are you telling me this tonight? She asked. Why not before the wedding? Why not in any of the correspondence you presumably had with my father's household? He looked at her then, directly, because before the wedding you could have refused, or been refused on your family's behalf, or the information could have reached the wrong people through channels I don't control. A beat. And because I did not know before tonight whether you were one of them. The room seemed to grow very still. One of them, Ilara repeated. The faction has tried before to place someone in this house. Someone who would observe, report, and when the time came, provide supporting testimony. His gaze was steady on hers, measuring something. Your father is a bankrupt man with a great deal to gain from the right connection. You were offered to me through an intermediary I have since identified as having a tangential relationship with one of the three central figures. He said it plainly, without softening it, but also without accusation, as though he were presenting evidence to someone he respected enough to trust with unpleasant facts. I accepted the arrangement because I needed to understand what I was being given. A weapon pointed at me or something else. And now, Ilara said. Her voice was even. She was very glad in this moment for the wall she had built around the softest parts of herself, because without it something would have been visible on her face that she was not ready to show. And now, he said slowly, I believe, I am not certain, I am rarely certain, I have learned to be careful with certainty, but I believe you did not know. I believe you were handed over the same way a man hands over something he no longer has use for and does not particularly consider whether the thing itself has preferences in the matter. His voice was very quiet. I believe your father sold you to a situation he had been told posed no real danger, in exchange for the cancellation of his debts and the promise of a connection that would repair his family standing. And I believe you walked into this chapel this morning with no more information than the rumors you had heard, which were designed to be frightening. And you stood beside me, and you did not flinch. Ilara looked at him. The candlelight, the stillness, the 7 years of careful, private siege he had been living inside. The trembling, she said suddenly. At the altar. Your hands. He held her gaze. For a moment he said nothing. I have not trusted anyone in a very long time, he said at last. The last time I placed my trust in someone, it was used to construct the argument for my incompetence. A pause. Marriage is, he stopped. Began again. I am not, another stop. She had the sense of watching a man who was precise with language in all other things, struggling with the inadequacy of it in this one particular place. It matters, he said finally, simply. More than I had prepared for. The fire burned. The candles guttered faintly in some draught she could not locate. Ilara unclenched her hands from her lap. She looked down at the ring on her finger, fine gold, set with a single dark stone she had not yet identified, old enough to have been in his family before any of this. Then she looked up at him. I was not sent here to harm you, she said. I was sent here because my father found me convenient to dispose of, and you were the arrangement that presented itself, which is its own kind of insult, but it is not yours to carry. She paused. I have no loyalty to my father that supersedes my loyalty to my own integrity. I do not report to anyone. I am not a weapon pointed at you. She watched him receive this, watched him sit with it the way she had sat with his disclosure, carefully, without rushing. What are you then? He asked quietly, not provocatively, with genuine, careful wanting to know. I don't entirely know yet, she said. I have been here less than 2 days, but I know what I am not. And I know that if someone has been trying to destroy you by design, and if you have been surviving it alone, and if what you need is someone in this house who is not a threat, she held his gaze, then, at minimum, you have that. The silence that followed was different from any silence that had come before it. It was not empty. It was full of the fire and the candlelight and the enormous, complex weight of what had just passed between two people who were strangers and were married and were, against all probability, beginning to be something else. Aldrich looked at her for a long time. "There is a great deal more," he said, "that I haven't told you yet." "I imagine there is," she said. "We have time." He almost smiled. The muscles remembered a little better than they had the previous evening. She was still afraid. The fear had not gone anywhere, but it had shifted its shape, and where it had been the formless dread of the unknown, it was now something more specific and more manageable. The fear of a known difficulty, which was entirely different, and which she had always found, in her experience, to be something she could work with. She reached out and poured them both more tea from the pot that had gone almost cold, and he watched her do it, and neither of them spoke for a little while, and the quiet between them was almost comfortable. The first rule Alara learned was that Aldrich Kane did not sleep at predictable hours, and that this was not madness, but mathematics. She discovered it on the third morning of her marriage, when she woke before dawn to the distant sound of movement in the corridor outside her room. She had kept her own room, and he had not suggested otherwise, and she had not decided yet what she thought about that, and looked out to see, through the narrow gap between curtain and window frame, the figure of her husband crossing the rear courtyard below with a lantern, moving with the purposeful quiet of a man who had done this particular thing many times and required no light beyond what he carried. She had lain awake afterward thinking about it. She catalogued what she knew. He read correspondence late into the night. She had seen the light beneath his study door when she had passed it at an hour when the rest of the household was long since settled. He was present at the breakfast table in the mornings, but absent from it some days without explanation, appearing instead at midday or not at all. He walked in the garden before the rest of the household rose. These were not the patterns of a man unmoored from reason. They were the patterns of a man managing a great deal of mental weight, distributing it across a day in the way a careful traveler distributes a heavy load. A little here, a little there, nothing in one place long enough to break through. She filed this away. The second rule was that certain parts of the castle were not for her. Not locked, exactly. Mrs. Aldrin had given her a key ring on her second morning that was heavy with enough iron to suggest comprehensive access. But there were 3 rooms at the end of the north corridor that had been introduced to her on the initial tour with a careful, deliberate vagueness of someone indicating that a door existed without recommending it be opened. She did not open them. She noted where they were, and she left them alone, and she waited, because she had learned already that patience in this house was a currency that appreciated with time. The third rule, and this one she had not been told but had observed, was that the staff of Ashenmore were fiercely, almost militantly loyal to their employer, and that this loyalty was not coerced. She had expected, coming in with the weight of the rumors she'd carried, to find a household operating under tension. Servants who moved with the careful, minimized gestures of people trying not to attract attention, the flinching deference of a staff that feared its employer. She found instead something that resembled, more than anything else, a garrison. Not unhappy, not afraid, purposeful, protective. The young footman who had handed her from the carriage on the first day, Thomas, she had learned his name by the second, had a way of positioning himself between the Duke and any door when strangers were present that was entirely too practiced to be accidental. Mrs. Aldrin ran the household with the quiet, competent authority of a woman who had decided long ago that her employer was worth the running of it. Even the kitchen staff, whom Alara encountered early one morning when she came down before anyone expected her, had greeted her with a cautious but willing assessment of people deciding whether the new arrival was to be trusted with the thing they cared about. She had the feeling, growing slowly but persistently, that Ashenmore was not a house under siege from within. It was a house under siege from without, and everyone inside it knew it, and had arranged themselves accordingly. On the 4th day, she explored. She did this methodically, beginning with the parts of the castle she had already been shown and extending outward from them with a careful, grid-like thoroughness she applied to anything she genuinely wanted to understand. The library came first and stopped her for the better part of the morning because it was extraordinary. The floor to ceiling on 3 walls, a rolling ladder, and the kind of collection that only accumulated when someone had been acquiring books for love rather than display, dog-eared spines, marginalia visible from 3 feet away, an organizational system that appeared, at first glance, to be idiosyncratic to the point of chaos, but which revealed, as she moved along the shelves, its own internal logic. History and natural philosophy shelved together where they intersected. Navigation beside astronomy, beside classical geography. A whole section, she found in the far corner, dedicated to legal theory and inheritance law. The volumes there more heavily annotated than anything else. Notes in a hand she recognized from the documents she had glimpsed on his desk, cramped and precise and very dense. She pulled one of the legal volumes and read a page of his marginalia. It was not the writing of a man in any way separated from his reason. It was the writing of a man building a case. She put it back carefully, exactly as she had found it. The grounds came next on the 5th day, when the morning produced a rare thin winter sunlight that made the cold almost bearable. She walked the garden, which was larger than it appeared from the upper windows, and had been laid out with an ambition that the current state of neglect, partial not total, as though it were being maintained by someone working alone without enough hours, only partly concealed. Old roses cut back. A kitchen section still producing the last of the autumn herbs. An orchard of maybe 20 trees, bare now, stretching toward the east wall. She was examining the espaliered pear trees against the south wall when she became aware that she was not alone. Aldrich was standing at the far end of the garden, by the gate in the eastern wall, watching her with a still, measuring attention she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he paid attention, not surveillance, not suspicion, but focus. As though when something had his interest, it had all of it. "I didn't know you were here," she said. She was not startled. She was a little annoyed with herself for not noticing sooner. "I was here first," he said mildly. She looked at the gate behind him. "Where does that lead?" "The lower grounds. The woodland." He paused. "Eventually the road." She looked at him. "Is that meant to be an offer or a test?" The almost smile, more fluent now than it had been, as though it were recovering from a long disuse. "Neither. I was going to walk the boundary. You are welcome to come, if the cold doesn't trouble you." She fell into step beside him. They walked for perhaps an hour through the grounds and into the first reaches of the woodland that formed Ashimore's northern boundary, and he showed her things as they went, not performing the role of a guide, exactly, but pointing out in the passing, understated way of someone who had a genuine relationship with a place. The spring that ran clean even in dry years. The old boundary stones carved with markings that predated the current family by centuries. The break in the tree line, through which, on a clear day, you could see the distant smoke from the nearest village. She learned more in that hour than she had from any amount of observation through windows. He had tenants, more than she had expected, the estate extending further than its forbidding walls suggested, and they were not afraid of him. She could tell by the way he spoke about them. Specific names, specific situations, a precise knowledge of who was managing well, and who had had a hard autumn, and what had been done about it. A family called Henner, the father newly widowed with 5 children under 12, who had been given the winter rent in abeyance. An older couple in the eastern farmstead whose roof had been replaced in September. He spoke about these people the way you spoke about people who were your responsibility and whom you took seriously, and the casual competence of it, the complete absence of the grand noblesse oblige she was accustomed to hearing from men of his rank, did something new and specific to the structure she had been carefully building around her heart. She took note of this too. She had been taking notes of many things. "The village," she said, as they turned back toward the castle. "The one we can see from the tree line. They believe the rumors? About you?" He was quiet for a step or two. "Some do," he said. "Others have sufficient direct experience to have reached different conclusions. But rumor has its own momentum, independent of evidence." A pause, which is rather the point of it, when it is being deliberately made. "Have you considered," she said carefully, "fighting it differently? The rumor, I mean. Not through legal channels, but publicly, showing yourself differently to the people who only have what they've been told." He looked at her sideways. I have considered very little else for 7 years, he said. The difficulty is that every attempt I have made to present a counter-narrative has been used as further evidence of instability. A man who protests his sanity is simply a madman who is aware enough to know he should protest. His voice was dry and precise as cut glass. It is an elegant trap. Alara walked beside him through the thinning trees back toward the castle walls. She thought about elegant traps. She thought about a man systematically dismantled from a distance, brick by careful brick. She thought about 7 years of isolation dressed up as evidence. Then perhaps, she said slowly, working it out as she spoke, what is needed is not a man protesting at all. Perhaps what is needed is someone else entirely, someone who arrived here expecting one thing and found another, and is willing to say so. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The castle was visible ahead, dark stone against the pale winter sky, solid and present, and, she realized, somewhat to her own surprise, already beginning to look, slightly, like somewhere she recognized. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the assessment, not the almost smile, not the careful contained thing she had been learning to read. Something rawer than those. Something that the 7 years had put behind very thick glass, and which was pressing, quietly and insistently, against it. You have been here 5 days, he said. Yes, she said. And you are already, he stopped. His jaw moved. He looked away from her, toward the trilene, and then back, and the raw thing was more contained now, but had not entirely returned to where it had been. You are not what I expected, he said, which was not what he had started to say, but which she suspected was true as far as it went. No, she said, with the slight, private warmth of someone who has been told exactly this before and has come to regard it as the nearest thing she has to a calling card. They walked back to the castle together in the kind of silence that had stopped being empty some days ago, and the rooks called overhead, and the winter light held, thin and pale and surprisingly adequate. The book of maps appeared on the 3rd week. Alara found it outside her door on a Tuesday morning. A Tuesday she remembered specifically because it had been a difficult one, beginning with a letter from her mother that contained 3 pages of careful, coded inquiry into the Duke's financial arrangements, and not a single question about how Alara herself was faring. And she had read it at the breakfast table alone, and then folded it very precisely and placed it in the back of the writing desk drawer with the disciplined calm of a person who has learned to process disappointment in private and get on with the day. She had mentioned the maps only once. It had been 4 days earlier, during one of the walks that had become, without either of them formally deciding so, a near daily occurrence. Out through the east gate after breakfast, along the boundary, back through the orchard. They had been discussing the woodland's history, and she had said almost to herself that she had always wanted to travel, not grandly, not the fashionable continental tour that her elder sisters had dreamed of, but genuinely, specifically, to the places she had read about, the river cities, the old mountain routes, the coastlines that changed color with the season. She had said it the way you said things you didn't expect to matter to anyone, the throwaway confession of someone accustomed to their preferences being beside the point, and then the conversation had moved on, and she had thought nothing more of it. The book was old, bound in worn green leather with gilt lettering that had mostly departed, leaving only the ghost of a title on the spine. She picked it up from the floor outside her door and turned it over in her hands. Inside, the maps were hand-drawn on thick cream paper, the coastline slightly imprecise in the manner of an older cartography that dealt in approximation and wonder rather than measurement. Someone had marked certain places with small, faint ink notations, a hand different from Aldrich's marginal cramped precision, older, perhaps a generation back. A parent or grandparent who had traveled or wished to. There was no note. There was no attribution. It had simply appeared. Alara stood in the corridor in the early morning quiet and held the book and felt something shift in the precise, defended center of her chest, something small and warm and very unwelcome, because she had been very careful not to permit this particular variety of feeling, having long since identified it as the type most likely to make a person vulnerable to disappointment. She could not afford. She had decided in those 5 minutes of honesty on the morning of her wedding. to build new soft places in herself while the old ones were still inadequately protected. But the book was there, and she had mentioned the maps exactly once, in passing, without expectation, and he had heard her. He had heard her the way no one in her family had ever heard her, not as a background noise to be tolerated or an inconvenient preference to be redirected, but as a person saying a real thing that was worth retaining. She took the book inside. She placed it on the writing desk beside the flowers, new ones she had noticed, replaced without comment every 4 days. Always something that had come from the glass house, always something that required effort to obtain. She sat down and opened it to the first page and spent the better part of an hour with it. And when she emerged for their morning walk, she said nothing about the book, and neither did he, but she was aware, and he was aware that she was aware, and the awareness moved between them all morning like a third presence, warm and a little dangerous. The cracks, she understood later, had begun before the book. She simply hadn't named them until then. There was the morning, early in the second week, when she had come upon him in the library before he expected her. She had learned to move quietly in Ashmore, not because she was hiding, but because the castle had a quality of absorption, of drawing sound inward, that made loud movement feel like an intrusion, and found him standing before one of the south-facing windows with a letter in his hand and an expression on his face that he had not managed to arrange before she appeared. She had seen it for perhaps 3 seconds before he heard her and turned, and the arrangement happened. 3 seconds was enough. The expression had been exhausted and lonely, and stripped of all the careful architecture he normally maintained, and it had the quality, she thought about this afterward many times, of a room seen briefly through an accidentally opened door before it swings shut again. Something private, something true. She had said good morning and gone to the shelves and selected a book and said nothing about what she had seen. But she had carried it. There was the evening she had discovered his humor. It had been accidental, the way the best things were. They had been at dinner. They dined together, had established this without discussion, because not dining together would have required a deliberate choice, and neither had made it. And she had been describing, with the dry, unsentimental precision she used when discussing her family, the particular social mechanics of her father's house during the period when his finances first began their decline, the progressive disappearance of the better wine, the tactical redeployment of the dining room, silver, the careful management of which visitors were received in which room based on what they were likely to notice. She had told it factually, without self-pity, and he had listened with his usual complete attention, and then, when she reached the part about the silver, he had said, very quietly and very dry, "My second cousin did something similar." He replaced the portrait frames with painted wood and told guests the originals had been sent for restoration for 4 consecutive years. She had laughed. Genuinely. With her whole face, not the managed social laugh she produced for drawing rooms, but the real thing, the one that surprised her by arriving. And he had looked at her with that expression, the almost smile grown slightly more actual, something lighting briefly in the gray of his eyes. And she had understood in that moment that there was wit in him, dry and precise and quite wicked at the edges, that had been driven underground by necessity and lived now in very occasional flashes, like light through old shutters. She had started, after that evening, to say things she thought might find it again. She was not proud of this. She noted it with the honest, slightly exasperated self-awareness she tried to apply to her own behavior, but she did not stop. There was also the morning she had walked into the study to return a document he had left at the breakfast table. She had not knocked, having been told by Mrs. Aldrin that the study was accessible to her, and found him not at the desk, but on the floor beside it, cross-legged on the rug, surrounded by papers arranged in a pattern she could not immediately decipher, working through something with a focused, almost childlike concentration of a person whose mind had completely departed the present and was living fully inside a problem. He had been entirely unaware of her. He had 1 paper in his hand and 2 more under his left knee that he had clearly placed there to stop the moving, and then forgotten, and his hair was worse than usual, and he was talking to himself, very quietly, running through some logic she couldn't hear. She had set the document on the corner of the desk and withdrawn before he noticed her, and she had stood in the corridor for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes on the middle distance, and addressed herself very firmly on the subject of the direction in which her feelings were moving. The address had been largely ineffective. She told herself, reasonably, that what she was experiencing was the natural consequence of close proximity and isolation. There was no one else here whose mind was worth engaging. There was no society, no distraction, no alternative form of stimulation. Under these conditions, finding an intelligent and complicated person interesting was not sentiment. It was simple arithmetic. She believed this for approximately 2 days. The map book had appeared on the 3rd week, and with it the necessity of honesty. She sat with the honesty for a long time. She examined it from several angles. With the unflinching methodology she had applied to difficult realities all her life. She did not refuse to look at it or dress it in safer language. She looked at it directly and she named it. She was beginning to care about this man. Not as a category, not as the Duke, not as my husband, not as the situation I have been placed in, but as a specific person, with a specific mind and specific hands, and a specific, exhausted loneliness that she recognized the shape of because she had been carrying a version of it herself. This was, she acknowledged, genuinely inconvenient. She was not naive. She understood the asymmetry of their positions. She understood that attraction was not the same as safety, and that a man could be interesting and still be capable of harm, and that the rumors, though she now believed they had been manufactured out of something, out of a man who had, at some point, given his enemies enough access to build with. She did not know all the walls of Aldricane yet. She did not know all the rooms, all the locked doors, all the places where the damage from 7 years of siege had gone inward rather than outward. But she was beginning to know the shape of the light in his face when he heard something that interested him. She was beginning to know the particular quality of his silence when he was thinking versus the quality of it when he was troubled. She was beginning to know which part of the orchard he stood in when the morning was clear and which part when the post had brought something difficult. She was, in other words, paying attention to him with the same care and specificity with which he had always paid attention to her. And that was a different kind of intimacy than either of them had agreed to, and it was already well underway. She went to dinner that evening and sat across the candlelit table from him and was normal. And he was normal, and they talked about the tenants and the winter preparations and a letter from his solicitor that had required a measured response. And at some point he said something dry about the solicitor's habit of describing catastrophic legal developments in the tone of a man discussing mildly disappointing weather. And she laughed again, the Real laugh, and he looked at her across the table in the candlelight with the gray eyes and the not quite smile, and she thought, this is happening. She refilled her wine glass. She thought, I will need to be careful. She thought, I am already not being careful. Outside, the first frost of winter arrived without announcement, silvering the garden and the orchard and the old boundary stones, and Ashenmore held its breath, and the candles burned, and across the table from her, the Duke of Ashenmore almost smiled. The letter that changed everything arrived on a Wednesday, tucked inside a bundle of estate correspondence, so ordinary in its outer appearance that it had been placed without ceremony on the breakfast table alongside invoices and a seed catalogue, and Alara would not have noticed it at all except that she was sitting closest to the pile when it arrived, and she saw, as she sorted through it with the casual helpfulness she had adopted in lieu of having anything more formally useful to do, that the wax seal on one particular envelope had been broken and repressed. It was a skilled repressing. Whoever had done it had been careful and practiced, using what appeared to be a close approximation of the original seal, a generic merchant's mark, nothing identifiable. But Alara had spent 18 years in a house where financial desperation had produced a sustained culture of small deceits, and she had developed, as a consequence, a sensitivity to the evidence of concealment the way some people developed sensitivity to changes in the weather. She felt it before she analyzed it. The seal had a slight irregularity on the left side where the wax had been lifted before it fully set the first time. The envelope's paper had a faint, almost invisible waviness along the top edge consistent with having been gently steamed. Someone had opened this letter before it reached the house. Someone had read it, replaced it, and resealed it with sufficient skill to pass a casual inspection. She set it aside under a book and said nothing at breakfast. Aldrich was at the far end of the table that morning, reading, eating, without attending to the fact that he was eating, which he had come to recognize as his default condition when his mind was occupied elsewhere. She watched him for a moment across the length of the table. The focused attention, the slight furrow between his brows, the way he turned pages with the same deliberate, unhurried care with which he did most physical things. And she made a decision. She would investigate first. Conclusions after. She was a quick study, and Ashmore had been teaching her for weeks. She knew the household rhythms now, who went where, when in the ordinary course of the day. She knew that the Morning Post was received by Thomas at the front gate, carried to the hall table, and sorted by Mrs. Aldrin before being distributed. She knew that Mrs. Aldrin was entirely trustworthy, both from observation and from the bone-deep instinct she had developed over weeks of watching the woman operate, an instinct she had learned to credit. Which meant the letter had been tampered with before it reached Thomas. Which meant either the writer who carried it, or someone who had access to the writer before he reached the gates. She spent the morning thinking about this with the quiet, methodical concentration she normally applied to books. By midday, she had constructed a preliminary framework. The interception point had to be outside the walls, which narrowed the field of possibility considerably. The correspondence that arrived at Ashmore came primarily via 3 routes: the main postal road through the village, the direct courier service Aldrich used for sensitive documents, and the occasional private carrier sent by specific correspondence. The tampered letter had come with the ordinary post. If someone was reading the ordinary post, they needed consistent access to it at a point between its origin and the castle gates. The most efficient such point was the village. She went to the village on Thursday. She did not announce the purpose of the visit. She told Mrs. Aldrin she wished to see the local market. There was a small weekly market, she had learned, that operated on Thursdays in the square, and Mrs. Aldrin had approved this with the careful neutrality of a woman who had opinions about the wisdom of it, and had decided that expressing them uninvited was not her place. Thomas drove her in the smaller carriage. She wore the green wool dress and a plain cloak and arrived without ceremony at the modest Thursday market of a small English village that had been living in the shadow of Ashmore's reputation for years. The market was 12 stalls. She moved through them slowly, purchasing a few small practical items she didn't need, and she listened. She was good at listening. She had spent her childhood being underestimated and her adolescence being overlooked, and both had produced in her the considerable social skill of knowing how to be present without being attended to, how to occupy a space at the margins of a conversation without becoming the subject of it. By the 3rd stall, she had identified that the village had a settled and specific set of opinions about the Duke of Ashmore, most of them negative, and that these opinions were confidently held in a way that suggested they had been regularly refreshed. Not the organic, gradually moderating rumor of a community reaching its own conclusions over time, but something maintained, a narrative in good repair, the way you kept a road in good repair when you needed it to remain passable. The postal rider, she learned by the 5th stall, was a man from the next village named Pell, who stopped at the inn at the edge of the market square for half an hour every Wednesday morning before completing his route. A half hour at an inn was ample time for a practiced hand to work a seal and return the contents. She needed to know who Pell talked to regularly at that inn. She went to the inn. The innkeeper was a broad woman of 50 with the direct, appraising manner of someone who had dealt with people professionally for a long time and had developed efficient methods of categorization. She looked at Alara for a moment and then said, without preamble, "You're the new Duchess." "Yes," Alara said. "What can I do for you?" Alara looked around the inn's low-ceilinged main room. 2 men at a table near the window. A boy sweeping near the hearth. "A cup of tea," she said, "and a conversation, if you have a few minutes." The innkeeper, her name was Bess, it emerged, had the 2 most useful qualities in a source of information. She paid attention to her environment as a matter of professional habit, and she had formed her own views about the Duke of Ashmore that were more nuanced than the village consensus. Her husband had worked on the Ashmore estate some years ago and had been treated, she said with flat precision, fairly and honestly, which was more than could be said of the previous family at the Ridley estate to the west. She had no reason to love or protect the Duke's reputation, but she also had no reason to contribute to the campaign against it. It was Bess who told Alara about Silas Renner. Renner was a land agent, nominally operating out of the county's administrative office, but primarily, in Bess's estimation, operating in the interests of whoever was paying him. And the question of who was paying him had been of ongoing local interest for some time. He came to the village twice a month. He had a long-standing arrangement at the inn that involved a private room, and on certain Wednesdays, a meeting with the postal rider Pell that went on longer than professional necessity would seem to require. "What does he look like?" Alara asked. Bess described him. 50s, heavy-set, a particular kind of prosperous that announced itself in the quality of the buttons rather than the cut of the coat. A careful man. A quiet man. The kind of man, Bess said with the matter-of-fact perspicacity of someone who had spent decades reading people from the other side of an innkeeper's counter, who listened more than he spoke and was never quite where you expected him to be. Alara drank her tea and thought about Renner, and thought about the three men Aldrich had described at the center of the faction. The ones with satellites he was still identifying. A land agent with a private room at the village inn and a cozy arrangement with the postal rider was exactly the kind of satellite who would never appear in any formal accounting of the conspiracy. Peripheral enough to be deniable. Useful enough to be kept. She paid for the tea and thanked Bess and walked back through the market to where Thomas was waiting with the carriage. And she sat in the carriage on the road back to Ashimore and turned the information over carefully, examining its edges. She had an aim. She had a pattern. She had a location and a routine, and if she was interpreting it correctly, one clear thread she could pull that led somewhere inside the larger web. She had also, she realized, been doing this, gathering information, constructing the case, operating with the quiet, focused competence of someone who understood how evidence worked, without once considering whether it was her place to do so. She was the Duchess of Ashimore. She lived inside the siege. The threat was to her house, her household, her people, Mrs. Aldrin and Thomas, and the kitchen staff, and the Henner family, with their 5 children, and the winter rent in abeyance. She had arrived as a piece being moved across a board. Yes. But she was not a piece. She was a person. And persons, in her experience, had the option of picking up the board. She arrived back at Ashimore in the late afternoon, when the winter sun was already failing and the castle's west-facing walls had taken on the deep amber of the low light, which did something improbable to the dark stone, made it almost warm. She found Aldrich in the library, and she sat down across from him and she told him about the resealed letter. She told him about Pell. She told him about Renner and the private room and the Wednesday arrangement. She told him all of it with the clear, sequential precision of a person presenting evidence rather than an anecdote. He had gone very still within the first 30 seconds. Not the stillness of shock, a different kind, the concentrated stillness of a man whose mind had just moved very rapidly through a series of implications and arrived somewhere new. He listened without interrupting, which he had come to understand was his way. He did not perform attention. He simply gave it completely and trusted the person speaking to complete their thought before he engaged with it. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "Renner," he said. The word had something hard in it. Recognizing something he had been close to before without being able to name it. "Do you know him?" "I know the name. He was mentioned once in documentation relating to the land survey that preceded the Ridley Estate's eastern expansion." He looked at her. The Ridley Estate shares a county boundary with Ashimore's northern holdings. I had not been able to connect Ridley directly to the faction, but if Renner is operating on his behalf... He stopped. He pressed 2 fingers against the edge of the desk with the contained, deliberate force of a man arresting a stronger impulse. Then he looked up at her again, and the thing that was in his face was not the careful managed expression she had come to know, but something stripped of management entirely, raw and exhausted, and complicated with feeling she couldn't fully read and didn't try to name. "You went to the village alone," he said. His voice was very even. "Without telling me. I thought it better to have something to report before reporting," she said. "Inquiries fail when their purpose is visible in advance." He held her gaze. The silence stretched. That is precisely, he said slowly, the reasoning I would have applied. She did not let herself feel the warmth of this. She noted it and set it aside. The letter, she said. What was in it? He reached across the desk and opened the top drawer and produced the envelope she had set aside under the book that morning. He had found it then, or Mrs. Aldrin had identified it. He turned it in his hands. A summary of accounts from my solicitor in London. Nothing sensitive in the content, but a confirmation that I have been in recent communication with him, which gives them information about the state of my current legal preparations. His jaw tightened. They are watching the progress of my defense, which means they are aware that I am building one, and they are calibrating their timeline accordingly. Then our timeline needs to move faster than theirs, Ilara said. He looked at her. That look again, the one he could not entirely contain, that pressed against the glass of the 7 years. Our timeline, he said, quietly, as though testing the weight of the word. Yes, she said simply, and meant it completely, and watched him understand that she meant it, and watched something in him receive this with the careful, almost disbelieving gratitude of a man who had been alone inside a siege for so long that the arrival of an ally registered as something close to impossible. There is documentation, he said, after a moment, in the North Corridor rooms. Evidence I have been accumulating. I would like, he stopped. When he started again, his voice was slightly different, still controlled, but with an openness in it that had not been there at the beginning. I would like to show you. He rose, and she rose, and he led her down the North Corridor. And at the end of it he produced a key, and opened the first of the 3 doors she had not yet been through. And in the room beyond were shelves and shelves of organized documentation, years of it, meticulous and ordered, the slow, careful work of a man building the truth one piece at a time in a room no one else had seen. He stepped inside. She stepped inside. He lifted a lantern from the hook by the door, and the light spread out across years of evidence, years of patience, years of a fight conducted in silence and alone. He looked at her in the lantern light. Now you know everything, he said. She looked at the shelves. She looked at him. She thought about 7 years, and about locked rooms, and about the particular courage of a person who opens a door they have kept closed for a very long time. Not everything, she said, but enough to start. The weeks that followed the opening of the North Corridor room had the quality of a held breath finally, partially released, not exhaled fully, not yet, but the chest expanded, the pressure redistributed, the body remembering that air was available if you allowed yourself to take it. They worked together. That was the simple, extraordinary fact of it. Every morning after the walk, every evening after dinner, and often in the hours between, in the North Corridor room with its shelves of accumulated evidence, or in the library with its legal volumes and their dense marginal notes, or at the large table in the study where Aldrich spread his maps of the county land holdings and Ilara cross-referenced names and dates from the documentation with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had always had a mind built for this kind of work and had never before been given work adequate to it. She was good at it. She was in point of fact very good at it, at finding the connections that hid in plain sight between documents, at identifying the patterns that emerged only when you arranged the evidence by person rather than by date, at the particular mental discipline of holding a complex structure in your head and rotating it until the inconsistency became visible. Aldrich watched her do this with an expression he was making decreasing effort to conceal, and when she found something, which she did with a frequency that seemed, occasionally, to slightly unsettle him, he would look at what she had identified with complete attention, and then at her, and the gray eyes would have in them something that was no longer even attempting to be neutral. She noted all of this. She continued, with diminishing success, not to act on it. The evidence was substantial. Taken individually, each piece was defensible, explicable, the product of circumstance or coincidence, or the ordinary operation of county affairs. Taken together, in the arrangement they were building, the picture was clear and deliberate and damning. At the center of it were 3 men, as Aldrich had described: Lord Harwich-Dreen, whose family held significant court influence, and whose financial position had been in quiet, serious difficulty for several years, Sir Edmund Foss, a solicitor with access to the legal architecture required to bring an incompetency claim, And the Earl of Ridley, the estate neighbor whose land expansion had been blocked repeatedly by Ashmore's holdings and who had, Ilara had confirmed through careful correspondence with her own small network, a school friend in London whose husband moved in legal circles, recently made inquiries about the process of crown absorption of abandoned noble estates. Renner was Ridley's man, as they had suspected. The postal interception was one function. There had been others. Strategic placement of information in social settings Aldrich would not attend. Careful cultivation of the county families, whose attendance at the wedding had confirmed their position as observing parties rather than allies. And this piece had taken 3 weeks to extract from the documentation. An ongoing arrangement with the physician who had been called to Ashmore 4 years ago during a period when Aldrich had been genuinely ill with a fever that had run high and long, and who had subsequently provided a written account of that illness to Foss that characterized it in language several careful degrees beyond what the actual medical record supported. He was paid, Ilara said, on the evening they confirmed it. She was looking at the physician's letter and the payment record she had found cross-referenced in a separate ledger Aldrich had obtained through his London solicitor. Directly, the money moved through a holding account. Here, she placed the 2 documents side by side on the table. The dates match exactly. Aldrich was standing behind her left shoulder, close enough that she was aware of him with the heightened, specific awareness she had stopped pretending was not present. He looked at the documents for a long moment. "That is," he said, "the clearest piece we have." "It is not enough on its own," she said. "But combined with the land survey records and the Renner correspondence and Lady Cecilia's travel documentation, it builds the pattern past the threshold of coincidence," he said. "Yes." He straightened. "I need to take this to my solicitor in London. Not by letter. In person. I need to be there to make the argument, to present the sequence." He paused. "I have been postponing it because going to London means being visible, and being visible has historically given the material to work with." "You would be going to initiate legal action," Ilara said, "on your terms, with your evidence, at a time of your choosing. That is different from every previous occasion on which they have put you in a visible position." "Yes," he said. Then, after a moment quietly, "Come with me." She turned to look at him. He was not looking at the documents. He was looking at her, and there was in the look an openness that was not the careful, incremental openings she had been navigating for weeks, not the almost smile, not the gray eyes briefly unguarded and then restored. This was a different quality, sustained, deliberate, frightening in the particular way of things you have wanted without admitting you wanted them. "To London," she said. "The journey is 2 days. The solicitor will need several meetings. And there are people," he stopped, and started again with the careful honesty that she had come to understand was his deepest habit, the one that survived even the siege. "There are people in London who should see that I am, that Ashmore is not what has been described. That there is," he looked at her, "that I am not alone in this." The fire crackled between them. The papers lay spread across the table with their years of evidence, patient and damning. The candles had burned down considerably since they had started this evening's work. She should have said of course. She should have said yes with the same steady matter-of-factness with which she had said everything else. Instead, she found herself looking at him across the documents and the firelight and feeling, with a clarity that was close to uncomfortable, the precise weight of how much she had come to care about this outcome. Not abstractly, not as a matter of justice or principle, but specifically, personally, because of him, because of this particular man standing in this particular room who had been fighting alone for 7 years and had asked her not to leave him in it. "Yes," she said. "I'll come." Something moved through his expression that he did not manage before it was visible. She turned back to the documents before either of them had to address it. The breaking point came, as breaking points generally did, not from the thing you were braced for, but from the thing you had stopped watching. It came 4 days before they were due to depart for London, on a cold grey afternoon, when the sleet had been driving against the windows since morning, and the castle had drawn itself in with a particular tightened quality it had in bad weather, every fire burning higher, every room a little closer and warmer against the grey. Ilara was in the library. She had been there since midday, working through a final cross-reference she wanted to complete before the London journey. And she was deep enough into the work that she heard the door of the library open and registered it only partially, assuming it was Mrs. Aldrin with tea. It was not Mrs. Aldrin. It was a man she had never seen before, perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with the prosperous buttons Bess had described and the careful, listening quality of a man who had been described to her in weeks ago. He stood in the library doorway and looked at her, and there was, in his expression, the rapid recalculation of someone who had not expected to find her here, but was not. She understood immediately, surprised by her existence in this house. He had known about her, was aware of her role, had simply not anticipated her in this specific room at this specific hour. Renner. She was certain before he spoke. "I beg your pardon," he said, with a smoothly unrevealing courtesy of his type. "I was told His Grace was available." "His Grace," she said, "is engaged." She did not stand. She held his gaze with a still, measuring quality she had learned partly from living beside a man who did it better than anyone she had encountered. "Are you expected?" A pause. "I have an arrangement with the estate's administrative office." "Yes," she said. "I know what arrangements you have." The smoothness cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. She saw him process what she had said, the specificity of it, the calm with which she had said it, and she watched him understand that the calculation he had made about the Baron's disposable daughter, the woman placed in this house to be managed or co-opted or simply ignored, was incorrect. She was still looking at him with complete equanimity when she heard Aldrich's step in the corridor. He came in reading a letter. In the way he sometimes crossed spaces, his attention still on the page, and he registered the room's arrangement in stages. Ilara at the table, looking toward the door, her posture carrying a precise and deliberate quality he had learned to read, and then Renner in the doorway, and the letter lowered. And what came into his face was not rage, which was what she had half expected, but something colder. The absence of all the careful architecture. The gray eyes stripped of everything, except a very clear and focused knowledge of exactly what was standing in front of him. "Renner," he said, in the tone she had imagined when he had said the name in the study the first time. The recognition of the named thing finally standing in the room. The meeting was short. Renner produced a cover story for his presence, with the automatic fluency of a man who maintained cover stories the way other men maintained correspondence. Aldrich listened without expression and then told him, in 3 sentences of polished legal precision that left no conversational handhold, that his access to the estate's administrative arrangements was terminated effective immediately, and that any further attendance on the property would be treated as trespass. Renner left. The library door closed. The sleet continued against the windows. Ilara released a breath she had not consciously been holding. She became aware that her hands, folded on the table before her, had been pressed together more tightly than she had realized, and she unclenched them and set them flat against the document she had been reading. Aldrich had not moved from the center of the library. He was still looking at the door. "He will report this," he said, "tonight or tomorrow. They will know that we are further along than they estimated, and that there is someone here who—" He stopped. He turned and looked at her across the room, and whatever had been carefully managed for the past weeks was, in this moment, not managed. "You identified him weeks ago. You went to the village. You found Bess. You made the connection. And just now you—" His voice was very quiet and had in it a quality she had not heard from him before. "You were sitting in this room looking at him, as though you had been expecting him, and you said, 'I know what arrangements you have,' and he needed to know that you were not alone," she said. The words landed in the room, and the room went very still. Aldrich stood looking at her. The fire was behind him, and the sleet on the windows, and the years of documents on the shelves, and the weeks of mornings walking, and the book of maps, and the dinners, and the wit she had drawn out of him piece by careful piece, and the exhausted, lonely face she had seen through the accidentally opened door. All of it was present in the room, arranged around this moment. And she was looking at him, and he was looking at her, and neither of them was pretending any more that they were simply two people engaged in a practical arrangement. "Ilara," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality it had never had before, open and direct and undisguised. "Don't," she said. Not cruelly. Quietly, with the firmness of someone who knows they are standing at the edge of something and is not yet ready to step. He stilled. He heard the not yet in it, which was not the same as no, and she could see him hearing it and accepting it with the same precise care he applied to all difficult things. I am not, she stopped. She pressed her hands flat against the document again and looked at them and then up at him. I need the London journey to go well first. I need this to be. I need for it not to be the case that I said something I cannot unsay, and then something went wrong with all of this. I need you to be safe before she stopped again. Before you what? He asked. Gently, carefully, as though he understood that the answer was already there and simply needed time. She looked at him across the library. The sleet, the fire, the years of evidence of a man who had been worth fighting for, without anyone fighting for him. Before I allow myself to be sure, she said. He held her gaze for a long time. Then he nodded, a single careful nod, the nod of a man who had asked something enormous and been given something that, if he was patient, was more than enough. Then let us go to London, he said, and let it go well. She picked up her pen. He crossed the shelves and pulled the document she needed. They went back to work. But the room was different now. Every room would be different now. What had been unspoken for weeks was spoken, and what was spoken could not be unspoken. And Alara sat at the library table, with her hands steady on the page, and felt, underneath all the discipline and all the caution, and all the very sensible reasons she had for careful management of her own heart, something that could no longer honestly be called anything other than what it was. Hope. Deliberate. Chosen. Terrifying. London in winter was a city that did not apologize for itself. Alara had been to London twice in her life, once at 12 briefly, in the company of her mother on an errand that had been described as important and had turned out to be the negotiation of a debt arrangement that her father had not wished to conduct by letter. And once at 15, for 3 weeks during a season that her family could not quite afford and had attended anyway, which he had spent largely in the company of the wallpaper at a succession of events, at which her elder sisters were the point and she was the punctuation. Both times the city had struck her as enormous and indifferent, a machine too large and too busy to attend to any individual moving through it. She arrived now as the Duchess of Ashmore in a well-appointed traveling carriage with the Ashmore crest on the door, and London was still enormous and still largely indifferent, but she moved through it differently. She sat straight against the carriage seat and watched the streets unreal past the window. The morning commerce, the winter fog sitting low over the rooftops, the particular grey-gold light that London produced when the cloud was high enough. And she felt, beneath the tension of what lay ahead, something she identified carefully before she trusted it. Readiness. They stayed at the townhouse on the Strand that had been in Aldrich's family for 2 generations and had been maintained, she discovered upon arrival, with the same quiet competence as Ashmore itself, smaller than the castle, inevitably, but with the same quality of rooms that had been kept for use rather than display. A skeleton staff, loyal in the way the Ashmore household was loyal, who received them without ceremony and had fires lit in every room within the hour. The first meeting with the solicitor was that afternoon. His name was Carver, a small, precise man of 60 with the contained, watchful energy of someone who processed information continuously and expressed conclusions rarely. He received them in his chambers off Fleet Street and looked at the evidence they had assembled with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who understood that the difference between a strong case and a fatal one often lived in a single document reviewed too quickly. He went through everything. It took 3 hours. Alara sat to Aldrich's left and answered questions when she was asked them, and was aware throughout of Carver's occasional glance at her, not suspicious, not dismissive, but recalibrating, the look of a man adjusting his understanding of the landscape. When Carver finished, he set down the last document and looked at both of them across his desk. "This is," he said, "considerably more than I expected." "Is it sufficient?" Aldrich asked. Carver was quiet for a moment. "The physician's payment record alone is significant. Combined with the Renner correspondence, the Ridley Land inquiry documentation, and the account of Lady Cecilia's financial arrangements." He picked up the physician's letter again and examined it. I believe we can make a compelling argument that the incompetency narrative was constructed. What we cannot yet fully demonstrate is the direct chain of instruction from Dreen and Foss to Renner and then to the physician. We have the financial connections. We need one of the parties to confirm the instruction chain explicitly, or we need a document that does. Alara thought about Renner standing in the library doorway. She thought about the rapid recalculation she had seen in his face when she had told him she knew about his arrangements. A man in his position, she thought, would be calculating the same thing she was calculating, that the case against the Duke had been moving toward a legal confrontation for some time, and that when it arrived, the most dangerous place to be was at the outer edge of the conspiracy rather than its center. The center had resources. The outer edge had only its usefulness, and usefulness expired. Renner, she said, knows he has been identified. He knows the estate has terminated his access, and that the reason is not administrative. She looked at Carver. A man in his position, working at the margins of an arrangement he did not design and cannot fully control, might, under the right circumstances, find that his interests lay in a different direction than they previously did. Carver looked at her for a moment, then at Aldrich, then back at her. The Duchess, he said carefully, is suggesting we approach Renner. I am suggesting, Alara said, that Renner be made to understand, through whatever channel is appropriate, that there is a legal storm approaching, and that his current position places him directly in its path. What he chooses to do with that understanding is his own affair. Carver was quiet for a longer moment. That is, he said, not without risk. Neither is waiting, she said. Aldrich was looking at her with the expression she had stopped trying to interpret neutrally. Carver saw this too, she was certain, and folded the observation into his understanding of the situation with the trained discretion of a man paid to notice what he did not mention. I will make inquiries, Carver said, carefully and indirectly. Give me 48 hours. They left the chambers and walked for a time along the Strand in the cold afternoon, because neither of them wanted to return immediately to the closed carriage, and walking beside each other had become, over the weeks of daily mornings through the Ashenmore grounds, the natural condition for thinking aloud. The city moved around them. A crossing sweeper. A bookseller's stall. Two women in deep conversation beneath a shared umbrella, entirely absorbed in whatever mattered between them. If Carver reaches Renner, Aldrich said, and Renner decides to cooperate, the faction will know within days. They will accelerate. Yes, Alara said. They have been preparing the incompetency petition for years. If they file it before we have time to present the counter-evidence, then we present it in response to the petition, she said, which is not our preferred order of events, but is still possible. He was quiet for a step. You have thought this through. I have thought about little else for a month, she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite lightness, but was adjacent to it. The almost humor she had developed as a response to the impossible, the small private refusal to be entirely overwhelmed by the weight of what they were carrying. He caught it, as he always caught things she did not fully voice. The gray eyes in the winter light were warmer than gray ought to have been. When this is over, he said and stopped. She looked at him. When it is over, I intend to say a number of things, he said carefully, that I have not yet said, and to ask several things I have not yet asked. He paused. I thought you should know that. The city continued around them, enormous and indifferent. Alara looked at the river visible at the end of the street, flat and dark in the winter light, and felt the hope she had named in the library at Ashenmore, steady and deliberate and terrifying, holding. I will hold you to that, she said. Carver's 48 hours produced, on the morning of the third day in London, a note delivered to the townhouse that contained 3 sentences in Carver's precise hand. Asterisk Renner has been approached. He has indicated willingness to provide a written account. He requests immunity from civil action in exchange. Asterisk. They had their document, but Dreen moved first. The summons arrived at the townhouse on the 4th morning, formal, sealed with the court's mark, requiring the attendance of Aldrich, Duke of Ashenmore, before a judicial panel convened under the authority of the Incompetency and Guardianship Act to hear evidence regarding his fitness to maintain his title and holdings. The date on the summons was in 6 days' time. The list of witnesses attached to it included the physician, Lady Cecilia's written deposition, and 7 county figures whose testimony had been, it appeared, organized without the Duke's knowledge over a period of years. Elara read the summons in the breakfast room of the townhouse, the morning light very white and cold through the tall windows, and felt a particular clarifying quality that genuine difficulty sometimes produced, not calm, exactly, but the sharpening of everything to its essential form, the noise falling away, the thing that mattered standing in full relief. She sent for Carver, before Aldrich had finished reading it. The next 6 days were the most intense of her life. She spent them in Carver's chambers, in the townhouse's study, and in 2 separate occasions at the homes of individuals whose position or knowledge was relevant to the case. Visits made by the Duchess of Ashmore, in a well-chosen dress, with the quiet authority of a woman who had been underestimated in precisely this way her entire life and had developed, as a consequence, a near-perfect facility for making it work in her favor. She collected 2 signed statements and a letter of character from a retired court official who had known Aldrich's father and was willing to attest to the family's history of legal and financial competency. She confirmed the timing of Renner's written account, which Carver received on the 5th day, meticulous, specific, and damning in its account of the instructions received from Foss and the financial arrangements connected to Dreen. Aldrich, during these 6 days, worked with Carver on the legal arguments, and in the evenings, was quieter than she had known him to be. He ate less. He moved through the townhouse with the contained, slightly compressed quality of a man bracing something internal. Not fear, she thought, watching him carefully, but the particular weight of a person who has been in a prolonged fight for so long that the approach of its resolution was itself almost harder to carry than the ongoing endurance of it. The ending was real now, in a way it had not been before. Real endings could go either way. She found him on the 5th evening in the townhouse library, smaller than the Ashmore library, but with the same quality of accumulated books, standing at the window looking out at the dark street below, and she crossed the room and stood beside him without comment, and they stood together looking at the city for a while, and then he said very quietly, "What if it is not enough?" She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "Then we find the next thing," she said. "There is always a next thing. You have not come this far by having only one option." He looked at her. In the dark of the room, with only the street light coming through the glass, his face was all shadow and angle and those steady, gray, 7 years tired eyes. "I used to be better at not being afraid," he said. It had the quality of a confession, something offered, carefully, from a place he did not show. "I don't think that's true," she said. "I think you were very good at being afraid and not showing it, which is not the same thing, and is in many ways harder." Something moved through him. She felt it more than saw it, a slight shift in the quality of his stillness, a breath taken differently than the previous ones. "Elara," he said. Her name again, in that open, unguarded way he had said it once before in the library at Ashmore. This time she did not say don't. She turned to face him, and he turned to face her, and in the city dark with the winter street below, and 6 days of exhaustion, and the hearing tomorrow, and all the weight of what was real between them pressing against all the weight of what was still unresolved, she said, "I know. I know what you would say. You don't need to wait until after." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the deliberate, careful quality of a man who was very certain about something and had been waiting a long time to be certain, he lifted his hand and touched her face, just his fingertips, against her cheekbone, the same slight, careful consciousness of his own strength she had first felt at the altar, and she leaned very slightly into it. "After," he said softly, "I intend to say it properly." "All right," she said. She stepped back. He let his hand fall. They were both very still for a moment, standing in the dark townhouse library with tomorrow enormous between them. Then she said, "Get some sleep. You need to be formidable in the morning." The almost smile. The real one, or close enough to it that the difference had ceased to matter. "I will do my best," he said. The hearing was held in a wood-paneled chamber in a building that smelled of old paper and formal consequence, before a panel of 3 judges whose faces had the studied neutrality of men who had heard many difficult things and would not be moved by anything less than evidence. The chamber was not large. It was full. Dreen was present to the left, with Foss beside him and a row of their witnesses behind. Lady Cecilia's deposition lay in a sealed envelope on the clerk's table. 7 county figures sat in a row with the careful expressions of people who had committed to a position and were only now looking at the room, considering whether it had been wise. Aldrich sat with Carver at the respondent's table. Ilara sat directly behind him, where he could not see her without turning, but where she was present, where the room could see that she was present, straight-backed and composed in a deep green dress she had chosen with the understanding that appearance in these contexts was its own argument. The Duchess of Ashenmore, who had come from a bankrupt baron's house and been handed to a man they called mad and had sat in this hearing room without flinching, was not the behavior of a woman who believed her husband was dangerous or incompetent. She knew the argument her presence made. She had dressed to make it. Carver presented the case methodically, over 3 hours, building the counter-narrative the way she had watched it built over weeks of evenings in the North Corridor room. Piece by piece, each element connected to the next, the picture assembling itself before the panel with the slow, irrefutable clarity of a thing that was simply true. The physician's payment record, the Renner account, the land records, the financial connections between Dreen and the intermediary accounts, the timeline of Lady Cecilia's departure and the subsequent purchase of her residence. When Foss rose to object, Carver was ready. When the county witnesses were called, their testimony, which had been collected and organized over years to paint a portrait of instability and danger, held up less well against specific cross-examination than it had against the comfortable assumption that no one would cross-examine it. And then Ilara was called. She had not expected this. Carver had not indicated it. She understood, as she rose and took the stand, that the opposing side had requested her testimony, that they had intended, perhaps, to use her. The new wife, the woman of modest origin, perhaps frightened, perhaps uncertain, perhaps a source of confirmation that all was not well at Ashenmore. She understood this as she settled into the witness chair and looked out at the chamber. She looked briefly at Aldrich. He was looking at her with the contained, still quality that was not stillness, but the opposite, everything in him present and attentive and trusting, completely, what she would do. She faced the panel. She spoke for 20 minutes. She spoke about what she had found at Ashenmore, not abstractly, not with the rhetoric of a prepared address, but with the specific, particular precision of someone describing what they had seen. The household, the tenants, the legal documentation built over 7 years by a man who had been systematically lied about and had never stopped methodically assembling the truth. She described Renner in the library doorway. She described Bess at the inn. She described the resealed letter. She described, carefully and clearly, the anatomy of a campaign. And then she looked at the panel and she said, in the steady voice she had trained herself to produce in the place of the voice that shook, I arrived at Ashenmore in fear, because I had been given what had been designed to be a frightening picture. What I found was a man of extraordinary competence and integrity who has spent 7 years surviving an assault on his name and his sanity conducted by people in this room whose financial interests required him to be something he is not. She paused. I am the Duchess of Ashenmore. I say to this panel, from direct daily experience, that my husband is the most capable, most rational, and most honest person I have encountered in my life. And I challenge anyone in this room to present evidence to the contrary that has not been manufactured, purchased, or arranged. The chamber was very quiet. The judges looked at each other. Foss, at the opposing table, was looking at his documents with the expression of a man recalculating distances. Dreen was looking at nothing. His face had the careful blankness of someone who has just watched a conclusion they had considered inevitable become, instead, a question. Ilara returned to her seat. She sat down behind Aldrich, and she saw his shoulders. She had learned to read his shoulders, release something very slightly that had been held there for the duration of the hearing. His hand rested on the table beside Carver's documents, and she reached forward, just for a moment, and placed her hand briefly over his. He turned it, just slightly, so that his fingers could close around hers. Just for a moment. Then she released, and he released, and Carver rose to present the closing argument, and the panel began its deliberation, and the chamber breathed. The panel deliberated for 4 hours. Alara knew this because she counted them, not by clock exactly, but by the quality of the waiting, which had its own texture and weight, and which she moved through with the methodical patience she applied to all things she could not accelerate by effort or intelligence. They waited in an anteroom off the main corridor of the building, she and Aldrich and Carver, while the winter afternoon pressed against the high windows, and the sounds of the city continued outside with the magnificent indifference of a place that did not know or care that something was being decided in a wood-paneled room 30 feet away that would determine the shape of a man's entire life. Carver sat with his documents and made notes in the margin of things he had already decided. He was, Alara thought, the kind of man who managed uncertainty by continuing to work through it, which she respected enormously. Aldrich stood at the window. He had been standing there for most of the second hour. Not restlessly, he did not pace, had never paced in all the weeks she had observed him, as though some early decision had been made about the conserving of energy and movement was part of the accounting. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and looked out at the gray London afternoon, and she watched him from the bench where she sat, the green dress slightly creased from the hours of the hearing, her hands folded in her lap with a composure she was sustaining by a not inconsiderable act of will. She thought about what she had said in the hearing chamber. She turned the words over and examined them, not with doubt. She had meant every word and would say them again, but with the clear-eyed recognition that she had said something publicly and irrevocably true about how she felt about this man, in a room full of witnesses, before she had said the equivalent of it to him directly, which was, she thought, perhaps slightly backwards. But then very little about the past weeks had proceeded in the conventional order, and she had stopped expecting it to. In the third hour, Aldrich turned from the window and looked at her. "You don't have to stay," he said. It was not what he meant. She had learned by now to hear what lived underneath the things he said, the careful, economical surface and the fuller thing below. "I know," she said. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the bench, not close, leaving a careful inch of space between them, the kind of distance that was not actually distance at all, but the form that distance took when two people were very aware of each other. He sat with his forearms resting on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment, and then at her. "What you said in there," he began. "I meant it," she said, before he could qualify it or question it or frame it as something she might want to reconsider. All of it. Every word. He was quiet. She felt him sitting with this, not doubting it, she thought, but receiving it, the way you received something you had stopped expecting and had to make new room for. "The most honest person you have encountered in your life," he said, quietly, as though reading it from somewhere it had been written. "Yes," she said. "That is," he stopped. He pressed his lips together briefly. She had learned that this particular gesture meant he was fighting the instinct to deflect, to turn a feeling sideways into something more manageable. He was, she had observed, extremely skilled at turning feelings sideways. He was, she had also observed, becoming gradually less inclined to do it. "I don't know," he said slowly, "what I have done to deserve that characterization. I am aware that I have been, for the entirety of your acquaintance with me, a man under siege conducting a covert legal campaign and managing a household full of people I have charged, implicitly, with keeping my secrets. That is not," he looked at her, "that is not a straightforward person to have been presented with at 18. "No," she said. "It isn't." She looked at him steadily. "And yet here we are." Something moved through his expression. The rawness she had first seen in the library at Ashmore, less contained now than it had been then. 7 years was a long time to maintain a wall, and the wall had, over the past months, been coming down, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the way that walls came down when something patient and consistent pressed against them. A stone at a time, the mortar giving first, then the structure, then the light coming through. "Here we are," he said softly. Carver, with the timing and the discretion of a man who had been managing sensitive matters for 40 years, found a reason to step into the corridor. The anteroom was very quiet. "I should like to say the things I mentioned," Aldrich said, carefully, with the deliberate quality of someone approaching something they have thought about a great deal and do not wish to mishandle. "That I said I would say properly afterward. I am aware that afterward has not technically arrived yet, but I find that I am a pause. The fighting of the sideways instinct, visible and losing. I find that I am not willing to wait any longer." Alara turned on the bench so that she was facing him fully. She said nothing. She gave him the room. He looked at her face, which he had been looking at, she thought, for months with the accumulating attention of someone learning the geography of a place they intended to remain in. And he said, "I accepted the arrangement your father proposed because I needed to understand what I was being given. That is the truth I told you on the first night, and it was true as far as it went." He paused. "What I did not tell you, what I had no language for yet, because I had not yet experienced it, was that within the first week, the calculation changed entirely." She kept her eyes on his. "Within the first week," he said, "you were no longer a variable I was assessing. You were the most interesting person I had spoken to in 7 years. You were patient and rigorous and entirely without self-pity. You went to the village and found Bess and came home and told me about Renner with the composure of a woman reporting on a botanical excursion. You laughed at dinner in a way that was—" He stopped. His jaw moved. "You laughed, and it was the first time in a very long time that anything in this house felt like something a person might actually want to live inside. The anteroom, the gray afternoon light, the city outside, for hours of waiting arriving quietly at this. I am not practiced at this," he said. The most honest thing, perhaps, he had said yet, and he had said many honest things. "I am aware that I have been, by necessity and by damage, extremely guarded. I am aware that I am asking you to, that there is an asymmetry in what I am asking, because you were given to me and did not choose." "Aldrich," she said. He stopped. "I choose now," she said. "That is the point. Whatever I was given, I am here now, because I choose to be. I have been choosing every morning for months." He looked at her with those gray eyes that had been still and storm-colored and gradually, incrementally, increasingly full of something she had no desire to misname. "I love you," he said, simply, without architecture around it. The plainest and most complete sentence she had heard from a man who was ordinarily incapable of plainness. "I am, it is not a convenient feeling, and I am aware that the timing is." She leaned forward and she kissed him. It was brief, not tentative, but brief, the way you did something you had been thinking about for a long time and wanted to do correctly and with full attention. His hand came up to her face the way it had in the dark London library. Careful, conscious of itself, the slight roughness of it against her cheek, and for a moment everything else in the world had the good sense to be elsewhere. She drew back. They were still very close. His hand was still against her cheek. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying, with limited success, not to for quite some time." The noise that came from him was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of something releasing that had been held under considerable pressure for a very long time, and it was perhaps the best sound she had heard in her life. "Limited success," he repeated, and the smile, the full smile, not the almost, not the suggestion, but the real and complete thing that she had been slowly drawing out of him for months, arrived at last, and it was, she thought, absolutely worth the effort. The door opened. Carver stepped back in with the air of a man who had been in the corridor long enough to have read all of his own notes twice. He looked at them, at the slight distance re-established with great rapidity, at the quality of the air in the room, at Alara's composure and Aldrich's, something she suspected he would describe in his private accounting only as improved, and he said with perfect professional neutrality, "The panel is ready." They rose. They walked back into the corridor and down it toward the wood-paneled chamber, and beside her Aldrich moved with a quality she had not felt from him before, not the braced, compressed thing of the past 6 days, but something open, something that had set down a weight and was feeling, with some surprise, the altered quality of its own body without it. She walked beside him. Their hands brushed once in the corridor, briefly, and then they entered the chamber and took their places, and the panel's presiding judge opened his notes and looked at the room. The decision was delivered in the measured, formal language of legal proceedings that had been designed to contain enormous things in careful words. The incompetency petition was found to be without sufficient merit to proceed. The evidence presented by the respondent was noted, in particular the documentation relating to financial inducements paid to professional witnesses, the written account provided by the land agent Renner, and the testimony of the Duchess of Ashimore. The matter of the conduct of the petitioning parties was referred to a separate proceeding. The title and holdings of the Duke of Ashimore were confirmed in their entirety. Lord Dreen, at the petitioner's table, did not move. He sat with his hands flat on the table before him and looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man watching a very long investment expire. Foss gathered his documents with the contained, precise movements of a man who was already thinking about the separate proceeding and its implications for himself. Aldrich received the judgment with complete stillness. She saw his chest expand, once deeply, and then he turned his head and looked at her, and the gray eyes were undone, she thought, not broken. Undone in the way of something that has been wound very tightly for a very long time and has been, at last, allowed to release. She looked back at him. 7 years, she thought. 7 years of this. And it was over. Carver was shaking Aldrich's hand. The judges were filing out. The chamber was moving into its aftermath with the practical, unremarkable efficiency of a place that contained resolutions, and then continued. Ilara sat for a moment in her chair, very still, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, the relief and the exhaustion of the months behind it, and the thing that lived beneath both, the thing that had been growing quietly and persistently, and without her full permission from the very first morning, she had woken in an unfamiliar room in a castle that looked like grief and decided, in the absence of alternatives, to understand it. She had come here as a piece being moved. She had stayed as a person who chose. And the life that waited on the other side of this chamber, back through the city, back along the North Road, back to the dark stone and the garden and the orchard and the library and the morning walks, and the man who had opened the locked rooms and shown her everything, was not the life that had been taken from her. It was something she could not have imagined when she sat in a carriage on an autumn morning with her spine against the seat back and her eyes on the road, and her whole small inheritance of courage gathered up and held against her chest like something she intended to keep. It was better. She rose. She walked out of the chamber into the corridor where Aldrich was waiting, and he looked at her as she came through the door, and she walked up to him, and she said very quietly, so that only he could hear, "Take me home." The full smile again. "Yes," he said. "Let's go home." Spring came to Ashimore the way it came to all old places that had weathered difficult winters, not triumphantly, not all at once, but in small and incremental surrenderances of the cold, a degree at a time, until one morning you stepped outside, and the air had changed, and the stone walls had lost their deep midwinter chill, and something in the garden was green that had not been green the day before. Ilara noticed it on a Tuesday. She was at the writing desk in her room, which had remained her room by choice now rather than arrangement, though the door between it and the adjoining chamber had developed, over the months since London, a habit of being open. And she was writing a letter to her sister Mira, the weekly letter she had promised on the morning she left, and had kept without exception. And she looked up from the page and out the window, and saw that the first of the espaliered pears along the south garden wall had put out a spray of small white blossoms. And she set down her pen and simply looked at them for a moment. She had written to Mira every week. The letters had changed in character over the months. The first ones careful and composed, telling the truth in measured portions, reassuring without dishonesty. The later ones more open, carrying more of the texture of the life she was actually living. Mira wrote back with the particular vivid urgency of a 15-year-old who was paying very close attention to the world and had not yet learned to manage the size of her own responses to it. Her letters were full of observations and questions and, increasingly, a dry humor that Alara recognized as the thing she herself had developed at roughly the same age as a mechanism for surviving their father's house, and which she was glad to see Mira finding. She picked up the pen again. "The garden is beginning," she wrote. Asterisk, there are pears on the south wall. I have been told by Mrs. Aldrin, who knows this place in its bones, that in the summer the walled garden is something worth seeing. I intend to hold her to this. I have been learning to tend the kitchen section, herbs mostly, and one very ambitious attempt at climbing beans that Aldrich regards with what I can only describe as cautious optimism. He does not say it will fail. He simply looks at it in the way he looks at legal arguments he is not certain will hold. I find this very funny. He finds me finding it funny, somewhat exasperating, and somewhat not, asterisk. She paused. She looked out at the pear blossoms again. I want to tell you, she wrote, asterisk, because I think you are old enough to hear it and young enough that it might still be useful, that the thing I was most afraid of in the carriage on that first morning was not him. It was the life. The foreclosed life. The sense that what I was, and what I might become, had been decided by people who had not considered me sufficiently to decide well. I was afraid that Ashenmoor would be the end of something, asterisk. Asterisk, it was not the end. It was, in the way of things that are very hard before they are good, a beginning. But you have to walk into it. You have to keep your spine straight and your eyes open, and you have to be willing to see what is actually there rather than what you have been told to expect. That is the whole of what I know about courage, and you already have it. I have watched you have it your whole life. I am simply telling you it will be useful. It is always useful, asterisk. She finished the letter and sealed it and set it with the morning's outgoing correspondence. And she rose and took her shawl from the hook by the door and went downstairs and out through the east gate into the garden, where the spring morning was cool and bright and full of the particular quality of light that only arrived in the first weeks of warmth, as though the world had remembered something it had temporarily misplaced. Aldrich was in the orchard. This was not surprising. He was often in the orchard in the mornings, and she had long since stopped finding his habits surprising and had begun instead to find them in the private accounting she kept of things she valued, simply known. She knew where he was in the mornings. She knew how he held his shoulders when the post had brought something difficult. She knew the precise quality of silence that meant he was thinking versus the quality that meant he was troubled, and she knew now, which she had not known before, the quality that meant he was at ease, something she had not observed in him at all in the early weeks, and which had arrived gradually, quietly, the way the spring had arrived, a degree at a time. He was standing beneath the largest of the apple trees, looking up at it, and he turned when he heard her step on the path. "Blossom," she said, looking up at the tree. The apple was further along than the pear, clusters of pink-white flowers against the pale sky, the branches still winter bare below them, the blossoms appearing almost improbably at the ends of the dark wood. "It's a good year for it," he said. "The late frost didn't take them." She stood beside him and looked up. The light through the blossoms was the particular thin gold of early spring, casting everything in a quality that was not quite warmth, but was the promise of it. "Carver wrote," he said, after a moment. "Good news. Foss has reached an agreement." The separate proceeding concluded faster than anticipated. Dreen a pause. Dreen's financial situation, it emerges, was considerably more acute than we knew. The legal costs of the proceeding, combined with the withdrawal of Ridley's support, have been sufficient. He said it without satisfaction, which he had come to understand was characteristic. He did not carry triumph the way smaller men did, could not sustain cruelty to something already fallen. "It is over," he said, and the two words carried the weight of 7 years laid down. She looked at him, the spring light on his face, the gray eyes, which he had spent months learning the language of, clear this morning in a way she had not seen before the hearing, a particular clearness that she thought of, privately, as the look of a man inhabiting a present that had finally been made safe enough to live in. "It is over," she confirmed. He looked back at the blossom. "I have been thinking," he said, in the tone she recognized as the beginning of something he had assembled carefully before saying, "about the maps." She looked at him. "The maps. The book I left outside your door." He glanced at her sideways. "You never said anything about it." I said everything about it, she said. I simply said it without words. The smile. The real one, which arrived now with the easy frequency of something no longer requiring permission, which was, she thought, the most significant transformation Ashenmore had undergone in all the months since that first gray autumn morning, more significant than any legal victory or turn season. There are routes, he said, that I have wanted to travel for a long time. The river cities. A particular section of the old northern coast road that I have read about since I was 12 years old. The mountain passes in early summer before they close. He turned to face her fully. I thought if you were willing. Yes, she said before he had finished. I haven't told you the specifics yet. You can tell me in the carriage, she said. Yes. He looked at her for a moment with the gray eyes and the full smile and something beneath both of them that was not new but was, still, each time she found it, exactly as much as it had ever been. All right, he said. They walked back through the orchard in the spring morning, past the ambitious climbing beans and the kitchen herbs and the old boundary stones that had been here longer than any of the people who were always, in the end, passing through. The rooks were in the upper trees, doing their raucous, ongoing commentary. Mrs. Aldrin could be seen through the kitchen window, managing the household in the manner of someone who had been managing it through difficult years and was finding, in the improved weather, no diminishment of purpose. The castle rose behind the garden walls, dark stone against the pale spring sky, and it had not looked, Alara thought, for some months now, like a place holding its breath. It looked like a place breathing. She had come here afraid, on an autumn morning that felt a very long time ago, with her spine straight and her eyes open and her small inheritance of courage held close. She had found, in the place she was least expecting it, the life that had been worth the arriving at. She had found a man worth knowing, a house worth tending, a story worth telling, not because it was easy, but because it was true, and because truth in her experience, however long it took to find, was the only thing that ever actually held. The spring light held across the garden and the orchard and the old stone walls. Alara walked home,